I have lived long enough to know that opportunities must be seized or they will be lost.
Hello and welcome back to Wall Street Radio. I'm your host, Tanner, here with Dan. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about two articles that we released this week. The first of which we already discussed, the Alt Investments article, the second one on vaccines and how AI is going to play a role in healthcare moving forward. In addition to that, we're going to cover some political stuff. We've got Trump defunding the Department of Education, what that's going to look like, why he might be doing it, and maybe some of the impacts downstream from there. Enjoy.
All right, so which article do you want to start with today?
Well, let's start with the vaccines one, because that's more up your alley, and we already did talk about the Alt Investments. So let's jump right into the new one and kind of break that down. This one was written by you. It covers material that is way more up your alley than it is mine. So really just want to let you kind of break this down for us.
Yeah, I want to start kind of actually at the beginning of what inspired the actual writing of it. So I come from a science background. I mean, I went to school actually for engineering and then transferred over to do nutritional sciences where I got into a lot of organics, but then also had experience doing physics and math. So like the likening that I've had for medical breakthroughs in technology and even like biomedical engineering has always been pretty high. And when I first started investing and like getting serious into that type of world, I was really like, I did it passively during college, just from, an associated standpoint of buying Apple and never looking for like a year or something. But when I started like sitting down and actually I'd spend my mornings at a Bruegger Bagels and I'd spend like 5 hours, because at that time I did a shift from 11 to 7 as a sports nutritionist. I was studying like all these stocks, and for me it was like, when people get into investing, I think everyone has that story. It's like, especially people who actively trade or they actively invest in the market. It's like, what got you involved, right? Like what inspired you? What was your first trade? Why did you start it to begin? And everyone has that story. For me, right, this was like almost 12, 13 years ago. So it was well before the retail boom, I would say, through like meme stocks. The big thing for me back then was biotech stocks. And biotech, obviously being high risk, high reward, a lot of it has to do with phases of trialing, as well as like timing of the release of the product to the market. And like overall, it's it's difficult to trade, but for me, it was really exciting because I got to take, I just spent 4 years taking all of these classes about science. And then I was able to read these research reports from companies developing biotechnological advancements. And it was like, I felt a little bit more of a connection there and I could understand what they were trying to do. And for me, that's always been exciting. Like, for I've never actually been excited about investing in Apple or Tesla personally. I just don't like have that big of a connection with it. For me, it was if I could combine um, a positive investment and like, making money with also finding a company that develops a breakthrough drug, whether it's, a nasty disease like Alzheimer's or cancer or heart disease or any of that, like, that for me was really, again, inspiring to do the actual due diligence and research. And that's like, I'm going to go in a pretty long path here of talking, but I think it's important. It's like when you're getting into investing, it's like, what are you passionate about? Because if you're passionate about something, you're going to go the extra mile. You're going to care about what you're reading. And that's at that time I did, because not only were the returns substantial, if you could, accurately do your due diligence and understand the phase 1, phase 2, and associated trials, and let alone phase 3 trials, the returns could be dramatic and make a real impact. And at that time, my cash flow wasn't as high, so I was looking for big risk reward trades, but also where I can leverage my skill set. Fast forward, spent time at Abbott, which, in the healthcare industry and revolved around obviously a very substantial public entity that is traded and like, is able to produce to shareholders. And that was something I was learning more about and advancements. And throughout the years, it just, things started to trickle. And I've always had this one toe in the water with medical, whether it's been Tandem Diabetes Care was probably one of the largest trades I ever had. as a diabetes device manufacturer. Another one that that I was really into was Transmedics. Transmedics was a organ transplant supplier. They provide essentially a box or a packaging system for organ transplants, and that's like obviously very personal for me because my dad didn't have any kidneys when I was growing up. He lost his kidneys when I was a young kid, and he's had transplants, 2 transplants throughout my life. So like that was very personal for me, and that's something I cared about learning. And that kind of brings us to where we are today with the article. I had a conversation back in October with a good friend of mine who's a leading oncologist at one of the nation's top pediatric hospitals. And I asked him because I was just curious. I was like, why don't we have a cure for cancer yet? I've always found that to be like interesting. We have billions of dollars going into research, and we've had that consistently for decades. Like why haven't we found it? And he looked at me, he's like, we actually have a close to a cure. Like we're pretty close to curing a lot of these diseases, and people just don't know about it. Like compared to especially where we were 10, 15 years ago, some of these early stage leukemias for kids have 90% survival rate. If they're detected within like a window. And like, from his perspective, who's obviously acting with it every day, and his wife also sees it as well. He was very bullish and optimistic on it. And so that kind of like, since then in October, I was just really surprised. And I just started like, I would tell people about it. Like, did you know that we actually have legitimate cures for cancer? Like, and this is for pediatrics right now. Obviously like the later stage and age, the more complications, but I was still like, even finding a cure like that is pretty big. And so recently with all the AI hype and speculation, it's led me down this path of, okay, obviously the themes of 2024 that Tanner, you were able to click in on. And at that time I was still at Bloomberg. So I was not really as actively participating in the market, but you were identifying these themes in nuclear and NVIDIA, some speculation, but some, really what it is like NVIDIA driving and producing the engine for the AI revolution. And then you have like energy supplying the fuel. And so like that all makes sense, like the downstream implications of AI, like who's going to benefit, where's the supply going to be needed, and like where's the demand, and then like obviously that's going to drive speculation and price, and that's where obviously historic returns were brought for a lot of those companies. For me, the past couple of weeks, as I've obviously taken more time to think about the broader market and be more active, my interest, I think what actually spurred this was 2 or 3 weeks ago, I reached out to you, and I was like, you should look at the BioNTech stock and the NVAX stock, because they were forming like really consolidated moves after exaggerated moves during COVID. Obviously, like they're going to come down from the COVID production and sales, but their charts were starting to consolidate. And from a technical standpoint, I was like, hey, this actually looks kind of nice. And then I just started thinking, and I was like, well, hold up. Like AI has been hyped a lot with SaaS and obviously like semis, and it's actually like made its rotation in almost every corner of the market that I could think of. But when we think about medical, like the impact that AI and large language models are going to have on the development of medical research and specifically cancer vaccinations is tremendous and huge. And as I said in the article, I don't think it's crazy to say that we could have one by the end of 2025, if not within the next 2 to 3 years. I know that sounds crazy, but at the current rate and rapid development that we see AI developing, it would be actually remiss not to say that like I don't think we're 10 years out from a substantial development in vaccine. I think we're like within that 3 to 5 year window, and you have you have all these competing companies. One of the beautiful things about capitalism is it creates this competition, because if you can find a very, safe and effective cure or vaccine for cancer, which companies like BioNTech, Moderna, Pfizer, Johnson and Johnson, like they are putting hundreds of millions of dollars into this research, because 10 million people a year die from cancer worldwide, right? Throughout the 4 years of COVID, it was 7 million people. 10 million a year die from cancer. And that's only expected to increase actually at like current rates. So think about all the supply and demand, and think about, how effective that's going to be for people. And again, like we're taking it in a vacuum, assuming it's safe and effective. It's going to have a substantial impact and the profits will be ginormous. Lastly, just it's a long article, so I suggest you read it. I'm trying to summarize it the best I can. The only thing that right now is really unknown is two factors, and we can discuss this, Tanner. One, medical's really hard to invest in. I mean, like again, I've done it. I've won. I've lost. I've definitely lost big on some because timing is nearly impossible. For one, the phase trials are really tough to time. Not only to time the release of them, but the success, right? Like the dramatic success, and then the go to market. But then also like when does that actually impact the share price? That downstream effect of getting a drug approved and then having it affect sales, sometimes it can be really tricky. And because of Operation Warp Speed, it was actually very linear and direct for the COVID vaccines, which is why you see those rocket launches across all those stocks like Moderna, BioNTech, Pfizer, all of them, because it was like they were able to bypass a lot of the regulations. And then the other thing is these cancer vaccines with mRNA involved, the reason they've been highly effective in trials and tests so far is because of the customization. So it's actually not one vaccine for an entire population. It would be a personalized vaccine made for you, which does make sense, right? Because every cancer cell is unique to the person. And so you would have to, I assume it'd something be like you get a biopsy done of the tumor or the cancerous cell or even your blood, and then they would take that, create the vaccine personally for you, and then you would inject it. So that, I mean, that makes sense again from like an efficacy standpoint, but now you're like, okay, but what are those costs? That's something I'm not sure about at the moment. But nonetheless, like for me, it just presents an opportunity where AI is going to be able to gather all the market research and intelligence and statistics and be able to cross analyze and really do the due diligence that 100 people were doing 5 years ago in, a tenth of the time. And that type of rapid development and research is what's going to move us into the next phase and really into the next frontier of vaccinations. And that's really exciting for me. And so that's kind of like the summary of the article.
Yeah, honestly, that was the most interesting piece for me to think about when it came to the article, was that section that we had where it was like, okay, where was research 40 years ago? Where was research 20 years ago? And where's research now? And in the article, you had identified 40 years ago, people were carrying out this by hand, all of this data and data manipulation by hand. 20 years ago, you have the introduction of the internet. You have better analytical tools, being able to use programs to help make data more malleable. And now you have those programs that can collect data a lot easier. And then now you also have programs that can analyze and spit out different types of results almost instantaneously. And when you think about the learning curve of medical professionals to be able to better understand what's going on here, if your time to analyze and model out prospectus for different types of drugs, the time's going from years to days, maybe even hours. And this is a field that I have almost no experience in, which is why I've generally avoided it for the entirety of my investment career. But just that one little line that where you're talking about like how much easier it is now to analyze data, that to me was the most interesting piece of that article. And although I didn't understand much of what was going on in there, I understand that the more data you have access to, the more malleable it is, and the better you can analyze it, the better your results are going to be. It's why the world is so streamlined now in every sector, in every market. You've just got big data analytics on top of everything, because the better you can understand your data, the more effective you can be at deploying strategies around it. So yeah, definitely worth a read. And it's kind of funny you brought up like your early days of investing or trading or whatever it might have been in this type of biotech, because that's how it was for me as well. 2017, 2018, before the weed craze. The weed craze is really when I started to go deep into it. But before the weed craze, I mean, there were so many bio names. And I remember I would I'd pull up the list of stocks that had trial data coming up in the next few months, and then you'd pay attention to the stock like leading up to the date or whatever. I remember calling various offices at these firms and asking like their secretaries for like information. Would never
That is
get any.
crazy.
Would never get any, but I would do it. And yeah, it was always like, I don't know, like that's all I knew, because there wasn't much there wasn't nearly as much volatility back then as there is now. So to get big returns, that's where I would turn. I wasn't interested in options at the time yet. So I would go to these biotechs, and it's so, now I look back on it and it was so uninvestable. I mean, I didn't make any money back then. And the other thing too is I just wasn't passionate about it. Like I was interested in the money, of course, but I wasn't interested in the science at all. I was never a student of science in my entire life. I was always like of the opinion that hopefully I'll make enough money doing something else where I can pay for somebody else to take care of my health,
Yeah.
Never once really had a good think about that, but it certainly got me in the door of investing in trading. But now, like I said, looking back, it seems so uninvestable. I mean, you're gambling on the trial data no matter what. There's no way to have any good information leading up to that. If you know the science really well, you can make educated decisions. Like Martin Shkreli is phenomenal at this. He's called some really big failures and misses on the science side over the last like year or so since he's gotten out of prison. Story for another time. But I just could never bring myself to spend months and months and months studying one specific drug for one specific company for one specific trade idea. Like that, to me, I could never learn the science around it for such a period of time for what I didn't believe to be like you could do all this research and then it could pan out into nothing. Whereas like some more tech-based sectors, and like you mentioned, the ideas of 2024, to me, in my mind, it just worked out so much easier. Like the analytics of it was so much faster for me to work through and understand where the value was and where the discrepancies were. And I guess that just kind of goes back to like a conversation we've had a number of times about like everybody having their own style and their own kind of goals with investing. Like for me, I love to find the discrepancies between supply and demand. And those have been my biggest trades over the last 5 or so years, have always been thematic trades where there is something that needs to come to market technologically, and there are hindrances in the supply chain. And, as much as I discredit my college career, I did learn quite a bit from a supply chain management class there, which is, just the understanding that you could have an incredibly well-oiled machine, but if you have a pitfall in there, it could stop the whole system. So you find that pitfall in any theme for me, or investment basket or group or whatever it might be. And you just lean into that. And that's usually where the value hides. But anyways, that's a long-winded response, but it's a great piece and I definitely recommend reading it. And, it brought back a little nostalgia for me, bringing back the glory days of gambling on biotech stocks.
Yeah. I mean, it's a lot of fun for sure, but that's like what makes it so difficult is the fact that that's where inside information crawls out is
oh yeah,
with those medical reports like all the time. But again, for me, the interesting thing and the like admirable thing for me is if you can invest in something that, like Transmedics, for example, ticker TMDX. Transmedics was such a great company mission and like value, and it also did everything right. Like you're talking about a company that is helping literally save the lives of people who need organ transplants like very quickly. And it was actually funny. I was talking to my friend's wife at this thing back in October, and she's a cardiologist for pediatricians. And I asked her, I was like, do you know the company Transmedics? And she was like, yeah, we like just got a heart from them 2 weeks ago. It's awesome. And so, you think about that. For me, I don't know why, probably again, just from like a background in health and the history with it, I just find that really beneficial to look into. And like when you're able to participate and kind of be around that. And I think we're just on the forefront because medical took a seat for a long time. Medical was really, really big And it's cyclical, highly cyclical in the market, but like SaaS and technology have been driving this market for so long, and medical developments happen in waves and in spurts. You're never going to have like consistent things popping out. But I think with the development of AI and again, large language models, let alone quantum, if we ever reach that point of quantum, the medical world is going to absolutely fry, and going to be at one of the hottest sectors because they're going to be able to actually find cures a lot easier because they'll have all this data, all this due diligence. And you think about, one part that I wanted to mention is you think about the history of data itself, right? So like a lot of data wasn't able to be logged and recorded properly and then utilized back in the 80s and 90s and even 2000s. Like when I think about, for example, papers that I wrote in high school in like 2010, I don't have access to those. So, but the ones that I wrote back in college, I have some of those, right? So like the ability to save, store, clean data in the past 10 to 15 years has increased substantially. And so it's just something that I think we're going to be able to take advantage of. Whereas for the last 20 to 30, because again, these like large language models and AIs, they rely on the data input. We've never been in a time like this where we have mounds of it and we're going to have the engine to process it at a high speed. So, again, it's just one thing for me is I'm looking forward to the production, especially in the next 6 to 12 months, because I truly believe that Operation Warp Speed and COVID, for all the negative things it did, and you can feel whatever way you want about the efficacy of the mRNA vaccines and the COVID vaccines, it allowed us to do a lot of testing and we learned a hell of a lot. And that's going to be able to be utilized for future developments and advancements. And that's, again, really exciting for me.
Yeah. Now, that thing you did say about TMDX, Transmedics, that I understand. Medical devices make sense to me, at least something like Transmedics. And, that was one. Now, as you were saying it, I was trying to remember back. So I bought into that one 2020, 2021-ish, right around in there. And again, it was solely based on the premise that I believed in the company and I thought what they were doing deserved to be in every hospital around the world because, it just makes sense. And for those of you who don't know, Transmedics, they create what's called the Organ Care System. It's a box that essentially keeps organs pumping after they've been harvested. So, if somebody dies in an accident, unfortunately, and they're an organ donor, now those organs can be harvested. They can be put in the organ care system, and then their lifetime can triple in some cases, at least for a heart. So to put that in perspective, if somebody dies who's an organ donor in Hawaii, let's say, and somebody in California needs the heart, well, before the organ care system and before Transmedics, that heart wouldn't have been able to make it over the flight to get to California to be performed in an operation, right? With the organ care system, now it can make that flight. So it expands the reach of where organs can get to certain recipients. And it allows organ donors just to be more beneficial and allows people that are on waiting lists just to have more access at the end of the day because they don't need to have one within their area, within the state, within like a couple hours of worth of drive. Because prior to Transmedics, the best system that we had to keep organs that were harvested cool was a cooler, like no better than an igloo that you would throw some beers in. And that hasn't changed in over 100 years. So to me, the investment thesis behind that, and I've been very clear about this on my socials and in circles that I run in, that's a part of my portfolio that I didn't matter if the company made or lost money. To me, that just made sense as an investment from just like a good product standpoint. It's one of the only investments that I have in my long-term portfolio where I solely bought it without even caring about the price, the financials, the valuation, exclusively on the premise that it's a good product. And I believed in what the company was doing. And I thought that they should have a system like this in every hospital and every, country around the world. And I've asked I've asked friends that are medical professionals about this product. And they're like, yeah, we've heard of this. a couple of them have seen it and they're like, yeah, it's really cool. It's kind of creepy actually, the way that it works. And I urge everybody who's listening here there's a video on YouTube. You can just look up Transmedics Organ Care System, and it's like a 2-minute long video that just shows like how it actually works. And you can see the heart pumping in the box itself. And, I think that's a tremendous breakthrough in medical devices. And to me, that made sense. But as far as like some of the actual more science-based stuff goes, I just get lost there. But that's not to say there aren't opportunities, because companies like that exist.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's just something to watch. It's kind of like the podcast a couple of days ago, which I highly recommend people listen to, where we covered more in depth the idea of the digital, like alt investments, and your coverage of whether it's the digital or the physical and the performance they've seen since inception, but then what that means for the future of investing. And that's like where we've both been at the past couple of weeks, is thinking about, where are we headed, looking really like 6 to 12 months down the road, and not being so reactionary, but more proactive and looking to place developments and investments. And that's like, this enters that same realm for me, where, okay, we're looking at not only the physical space for some of these returns, but also we talked a lot about GTA 6 and what does that mean for the infrastructure of digital currency. For me, this is the same thing. It's, what does this mean for the medical world and the scientific world that's going to have access to new tools, and how do you position yourself? Because, I mean, to be honest, like we were talking, I was like, today feels like a Saturday. It's Friday, it's 2:30. The market has been really dry lately. I mean, it's a kangaroo market, if you will. But,
Kyle.
shout out Kyle. It's just not something to be actively staring at all the time right now. Like, investments are working, cash is in play, but also there's, for me, for example, there's preserved cash that I'm just waiting on. If we find more value adds and like more, again, like 200 SMA points or any historical ad points, I have all those conditionals, and AKA like automatic investments set. So it will take the trade. But other than that, now's a great time to just like think about the future and where you want to start positioning, because the market is cooling off, and some of these stocks and a lot of these companies have now entered back into more of a fair value range. And that's always a good time to look at like where you want to deploy your capital over the next 6 months, probably.
If you're shopping for 3 to 10 years out, which is usually what my timeline is on my longer term portfolio, now's the time when you start to think about what names you want and what prices you want to get them at. Because, if we're going to get continued downside, you might get great entries on stuff. And I know there's a lot of new entrants to the market over the last couple of years. COVID obviously saw a huge spurt in new traders and new investors. And, now this most recent bull run has seen a big spurt in new traders and investors. And, I just think when I first started in 2017, 2018, and the market was really running up into 2020, my thought process was, okay, I'm learning about all these great businesses. I want to buy some of these, but it just doesn't make sense. Like right here, it doesn't make sense. And then when COVID hit, it allowed me to get active on some of the names that I really wanted. And it's like, if we get a continued slide, maybe not as bad as COVID was, but if we get a continued slide, if there are names that new traders or investors have been watching for a while that they want to own for the long term, now's the time when you start to think about valuation. You start to think about what prices you would want to buy these at and be happy with those entries. Because, you generally don't buy the generational wealth buys on great companies while they're ripping all-time highs. Right. You buy them when there's a broad correction occurring, and the good stuff that you want to own is getting overcorrected to the downside. And there's a gap of value there where you believe price should be and where the market has it, because maybe it's just getting sold off with everything else. And that's the window in which I've always made my best long-term buys. And I think if there's new entrants to the market that are listening right now, it's like, of course you want to be active in this tape, because you feel like if you don't do anything for a whole day, you're wasting your time. But it's like, no, like if you do this right and you really plan good buys on high quality businesses that you're chasing, you could never have to touch those averages again. And that was something that I was talking to some individuals about over the last week with my buys on energy most recently. Like, yeah, I've been trading these on the way up for the last couple of years, but at this point we're getting 50, 60% pullbacks on some of these names. if we get close to a bottom here where the value is phenomenal and it makes sense for me, I might never have to sell these shares or even be in the red on them. So
Yeah.
So again, just kind of like a little note to new traders or investors, like, of course, if you want to be active in this tape so you can get experience, but at the same time, like, think about what kind of opportunities are presenting themselves in a large pullback. And especially if we get continued downside, like we're only down 10%, right? We could get a massive overcorrection to the downside, and that could present some opportunities that right now we're like, oh, no way. But if it comes, we're going to be like, holy shit, we're getting 80% off on energy names that need to happen.
Yeah, exactly. And the Magnificent Seven have been leading, Mag 7 obviously have been leading the market for quite some time. And so like a lot of the drawdown has been for like some of these large tech players, and it's been needed exaggeration and fluff being removed from the market. But overall, like, I have some names that are still operating. They're below the 50, but they're now above the 200. And so if we drop another 10, 15%, they'll go probably obviously below the 200. But the downside is now for some value names, it's looking pretty good. And I was talking to someone recently who was in a really good name. They bought obviously like 2 months ago, I think. So they're not at all-time highs, but close to it. And they were up at one point, I think like 8 to 10% on an equity trade. And they didn't, they were investing in it. So they did not sell, which, I was talking to them about, like, makes sense if you're not selling, if you're in it for the long term. And then we get this, broad market cool off. And so now they're down and they're like, yeah, I sold it when it hit the 200 day. And I was like, why would you sell it when it hit the 200 day? Uh, and so that was like a week ago. And now today it's back way up above, and like they would still be positive. And I was talking to him and I was like, listen, if you're in a name long, the 200 day is not the time to sell a position. It's the time to buy. If you're selling at the 200 day when you're long, then you were never long to begin with, right? Like you didn't understand the premise of what we're doing. So I just thought that was interesting. I mean, it's always interesting, investor and trader behavior and the psychological aspect of it. Fear kills in the market. And that's just one thing I noticed specifically over the cool down the last 3 weeks to, 4 weeks is people really got hesitant there. And we're selling some like good positions instead of adding at like huge value points. And so I'm sure the market makers were pretty pleased with that.
Yes, going to drop some original wisdom here. Be greedy when others are fearful, and be fearful when others are greedy. That's a one-off new quote. Nobody's ever said that before.
No one's ever said. First time live.
That's the first time. Michael Scott.
Wow.
But it's the truth at the end of the day. And you and I have been very adamant about that on the podcast, which I'm quite proud of over the last few weeks, is like, hey, let's start focusing on value here. We're going to maintain our positions as best we can, but at the same time, we're open to the fear and what that means for opportunities, because, you and I, you're still both relatively young. It's still in our best interest to be taking on risk during pullbacks and trying to buy into some value, because, we know what that looks like on a time horizon. If you buy high quality stuff at deep pullbacks, right, 10, 20 years down the road, you're in great shape. Now, It's so funny that we might look back on this in 6 months. The market could have gone down another 30%. We're going to be like, shit. But for the time being, if this is it, then, we'll have some good buys.
Yeah. I mean, and also
positions on good buys.
Yeah. And I'll continue to buy on the way down, right? Like wait for the huge exaggerated sells when it's well within fair value. And that's when you just go back to, okay, like how much is the company making? Are they now are they not only profitable, but they're producing positive EPS? They're obviously going to now start paying a dividend. Like there's a lot of things companies can do to entice shareholders, but if a company is making large amounts of money and now the valuation is going down for no apparent reason except a larger broad market slide, then I know I try, like more than anyone, anyone actively trading knows how tough fear is to manage. Fear is the difference between, right?
Mind
like,
killer?
yeah, I mean, it's like you would have 100% success rate in the market probably if you never experienced fear. Because a lot of it is just ignoring the noise in your head and the doubt and allowing, trust in a company and trust in the position to play out, because the market, again, historically speaking, has always righted itself after a period of wrong. But, that's not to, this is not to say that, like in that example, he sold it to 200. I don't blame him. Like it's a scary thing, especially when you're over allocated or you feel like you're out of position. That's a terrible feeling. And I've done it before. Like I've sold positions because I was out of position or I was over allocated. But it's not the right decision, right? There's a lot of, that's why like having a system, a trading system and policy about what percent is in, like how much cash do you have, and really putting yourself through theoretical ideas like, okay, I'm going to enter this position. Like if it drops 10% tomorrow, do I feel okay or am I going to be sweating? Like you constantly have to gut check yourself when you're doing investments like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Like, and that's why it's important to build that fundamental case around like where your buy spots are. Like buying into VST, the next day it did go down an additional 7% or 8%. And I was like, while I didn't expect that to happen, I'm okay with it because I know that the day prior when I bought it, the price was good. It was where I wanted to own that name. And, I was of the opinion that it would spend less time below that price than it would spend above it. And that wound up being the case. Within 2 days, it retraced back up and now those energy positions I had purchased are doing well. So yeah, know your spots and then also don't get over allocated. That's a really good way to put it, because over allocation, you could have the best position in the world. If you're over allocated, you're going to be sweating in it.
Oh yeah.
Right. You're going to be sweating in it. And that's why I think it's so important for new people that are getting into the market is identify how much of a portfolio you want to have in certain names. And not only that, but also recognizing that, okay, let's say you have like 5 names on your buy list. You're a brand new investor. You've got like 5 names you want to own and you have prices you want to own them at. You don't have to perfectly split that up between all of the capital in your book. Like if I know that I want to have capacity for more names, I leave some cash in the book to be able to allocate down the road, or add into something that maybe it's underperforming or whatever. Like I've heard so many horror stories of people who are like, yeah, I have 3 positions in my long-term portfolio and I want to buy this, like what should I sell? And it's like that should never be a question.
Right.
Like you shouldn't be asking yourself what in the book already should you be selling to make room for something else. It's like you should just plan to be adding more to your book down the road. Like always be flexible in that regard, because the more decisions that you have to make in your portfolio, the more difficult it's going to be to see good returns, in my opinion.
Yeah. And that's why full-time trading with a limited bankroll or full-time trading when you're still young is very hard and, in my opinion, nearly impossible, actually. Like, because you need to have cash flow on a consistent basis coming in to give you more leverage and, like, again, be able to reassess your positions, because you're not just going to start with 25,000 and then double it and then double it. And like throughout that period of trading, you're going to have big wins and big losses, but you're not going to have that much like liquidity. So like for those examples of people who have, right, like 3 stocks and they're long and they're like, I have to sell to gain a cash position. Sometimes that's because like they're just not making enough cash flow, and cash flow is king, especially with investing. So, it's definitely just interesting to see, especially that wave we had in 2019, really like 2018 to 2021, where a lot of people thought they could trade full time. You quickly learn that like, if you're not having a source of cash flow on a monthly basis or biweekly basis through another hobby or another job, it's going to be increasingly difficult to be successful.
Yeah, I definitely don't think I would have been able to stick it out as long as I did without having the backing of another job to be able to do so. Without the job that I had at the bank, which for what it's worth was a phenomenal experience and opportunity. I mean, I was able to basically take in a paycheck and do like 2 hours of work a day and then spend the rest of the time focusing on the market, which is obviously a unique scenario. And if anybody from my old bank is listening to this, I'm sorry. But it's the truth. But it's the truth. There just wasn't a whole lot of work. And I recognized very quickly, I was like, I can do the work I need to get done as fast as I can. And then I can spend the rest of the time working on building my portfolio and understanding markets a little bit better. and having that was certainly an edge, a plus edge, because I knew as I was just continually blowing up accounts that I had the cash flow to support it and continue to try. And I think that's important for anybody who's new. Like to think that you're going to come in here and do this well and play with the best players in the game year one with no other income besides like a starting bankroll, you're going to run into a lot of trouble. And I really think that's true of any like side hustle per se. Like we have some guys that listen to this podcast who are not in the finance background, who are in other backgrounds that are, maybe getting into e-commerce or some other fields. And I think that holds true for any of those fields as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. Anything else that you want to cover today? I mean, it's a slow Friday. That's all I had.
Yeah, I mean, we were kind of flowing there. I was thinking about, I saw some headlines this morning about Trump cutting funding for the DOE, Department of Education. And, I was curious on your thoughts about that. It seems people have enjoyed our political commentary and headbutts. So
they have? Is that what you said?
Yeah, let's hear what you've got to say about potentially cutting funding for the DOE, what that means, what that's going to look like, and any additional opinions you might have.
I mean, I'll be completely honest. I'm not going to bullshit. I don't know the scope of like what all is intact with the DOE. I know the whole point of it is to bring education back to the state level, which I'm not opposed with. I really, even as much as I want to disagree with you right now, I don't have enough context of like what exactly the DOE does and what the impacts and the ripple effects will be. I probably should know that, but at the same point, like it's just not. It's not a department that I worked a lot with in my time with Bloomberg. I was, a lot more was like defense focused. DOE, generally speaking, wasn't like where we put a lot of our time and energy, and I'm not sure if that's because funding wise, it isn't that big. I'm not even sure how much of like the budget, what percent of the budget they get allocated, and again, like where it goes. So, yeah, why? What are your thoughts? Maybe I'll just disagree with you based off what you say.
Yeah, well, I just been reading through Twitter and other news sources this morning and just trying to get a grasp of like what the situation was, because obviously you hear Trump is cutting the Department of Education and you're like, well, what does that mean? And to be honest, my mom is probably going to listen to this, and she is she's a curriculum writer, so she's very involved in these types of things, and I'm going to have to get more information from her. So Mom, if you're listening to this and you're screaming at the camera right now, I'm sorry. But what I had seen is since the 1980s, the amount of spend that the Department of Education has put forward is not being met with an equal amount or even marginally equal amount of increase in scores on testing for education, like reading scores, math scores, science scores. And now obviously I think it's fair to assume that those tests have gotten harder over time. So I guess it would make sense that there's not like a huge increase in educational scores in the United States, but just the cost of an education has gone up significantly adjusted for inflation since then. And after watching a couple of videos of people giving their own personal commentary that are more involved in the matter, it seems like a lot of what's in the Department of Education is not necessarily getting cut, but it's being moved to other departments, or it already exists in other departments. Like there was a large concern about kids not being able to get aid programs to get breakfast and lunch at school. And I guess that's already something that's in the Department of Agriculture, not in the Department of Education. So I think you see the headline and it's like, oh, Trump's cutting the Department of Education. Is this guy an idiot? He's got to be doing it because most of the states that voted for him were uneducated, which that to me just didn't sit well. Like that just doesn't make sense as a reason why. So, after I looked into it further, it seems as though he just wants to peel back the curtain on where the money is going to and where the money is coming from. And instead of having just a broad stroke Department of Education department, get it back to where the pieces that it's made up of back to where they're originally coming from, like the Department of Agriculture or the Department of Health and Sciences for like kids with disabilities.
Yeah, that's what I was figuring. I was imagining. That's why I didn't know much about what DOE did, because a lot of what I would think they would do would be covered, whether it's from state or local government or from other departments. And so I just looked it up real quick because I was curious, like what percent of the budget, the federal budget, goes to Department of Education. It's about only 1.5%. like 90 billion out of 6+ trillion, which is the budget. So, like quickly looking at where the money goes, K-12 education, higher education, student loan programs, the ED overseas federal student loan is in 1.6 trillion in outstanding debt. So that's probably why he's focusing there. But yeah, it's, one interesting thing is it talks about most public school funding, about 90% of it comes from state and local governments, which is what I would expect. So again, like I would have to do a deeper dive into what exactly they're doing at that department and like what the impacts are of pulling out. But as of right now, it's only about 1.5% of our federal budget, which is not a lot. I wonder, again, how much do we expect to save? And where, we're closing it, but are other people picking it back up? Like you mentioned, like other departments can overlap and like cross relay between some of the things and pick up different items. So it could be, it really depending on what the fallout is. If it's really just dismantling Department of Education, but still assigning the things they do to other departments who have their own budgets, or bringing those responsibilities back to the state and local programs, then I don't really have a problem with it. I think it just depends on how it rolls out.
Yeah, an interesting piece of information as well that kind of like sent me down this rabbit hole was I saw a few statistics from the U.S. Department of Commerce, so not nonsensical sources, and it was the change in illiterate individuals 14 years of age or older in the United States from 1870 to the present. And from 1870, 20% of individuals above the age of 14 in the United States were illiterate. From 1870 down to 1979, that went from 20% all the way down to 0.6%. So about 110 years to get from 20% to almost zero to 0.6%. Since 1980, that percentage has gone from 0.6% to 21%. So to me, it's like, when you think about how much has been spent, and while yes, it maybe only makes up 1.5% of our federal budget, when you think about that spend and where we're coming from, a 0.6% illiteracy rate, to me, it seems like even if they're doing good things with that money, there's clearly a misappropriation of funds in one way or another, where something has gone wrong. And whether or not Trump's action is the right call, it'll at least start the conversation to open up these statistics, because I didn't know this before. But now that I know this, I'm like, okay, there's a problem. Like, we can't have an accelerating illiteracy rate in a country that's supposed to be one of the best educated in the world. That just doesn't make any sense.
Right. Yeah, our education system has been piss poor for as long as I can remember. We're going back 30, 40 years. We are always in comparison to Japan and Sweden, who have way higher literacy rates and education rates, as well as like a number of other countries. My whole thing is like, I thought that that's all owned by local and state government. I'm not sure the influence that the DOE has specifically on that. So like, again, obviously there needs to be a correction. I do agree with the premise that like our academics are really poor. I think that could also go back to teacher pay, right? That's been a very correlated study where the amount a teacher makes is directly correlated to the literacy of their students and like the success of their students, which would make sense. But we don't pay teachers well, which is another complicated issue that, that we'd probably have to dive into a separate time, But yeah, again, like for me, it's just all about what is the real impact of what they're doing. And again, if they have no impact, right? If it's like, okay, they're not impacting the literacy rates, then you're probably going to have to ask yourself like, well, they should be if they're getting all this money. But then it goes back to, this being owned by state and local. So even in just a small 5-minute conversation we've had about this, I do wonder what the effectiveness of the Department of Education is, and if the responsibilities that currently live within it can just be displaced or transferred to other departments or other areas. And again, like we can use that money more effectively. That's what I'm interested in. But No, Tanner's mom, don't get mad at me. I just don't know. I don't know what I'm talking about.
The other thing too is that has been a popular piece of commentary over the last few years is like, as we see more things getting cut and slashed and, whatever, there's always this upfront concern of like, oh no, if you get rid of this, like it's going to spell disaster. And, if you look at examples more recently of just broad stroke cutting jobs, cutting, like especially in some of our major companies where we've seen huge layoffs over the last couple of years. I mean, look at like what Elon did to Twitter. And I know it's not a great example since Elon's now in the political scope, but look at what any of the major tech players have done over the last couple of years after cutting huge amounts of staff. And how everybody was originally concerned that it would lead to decreases in productivity for the company. And that actually hasn't been the case. And, I think if we look at the government through the same lens, it's worth a try. It's worth a try kind of just gutting these things and then seeing how they flesh out in the end, because I think for so long you've had so many people turn and bat an eye, or not bat an eye, that it's allowed for just rot in the core. And I'm sure there's great programs weeded in there that will hopefully come back, but I'm of the opinion that it wouldn't be hurtful to overcut and take out maybe a little bit more than what needs to be cut, and then add the good stuff back in, versus just letting it continue to run away and us to continue to accelerate spending on all these things. Because another conversation we've had on here a number of times, if you let debt accelerate, you get really bad economic impacts down the road, and nobody thinks about it until it happens, and nobody really cares until it happens, but it's the truth. And if we can prevent that, I think that would be ideal.
Yeah, I think there's a layer of complexion that happens when, or complication that happens when it's not a corporation, right? So like if you cut too much fat off a government program, I'm assuming in a vacuum that these government programs are being utilized properly, right? I can't like make a case. I can't sit here and take the opinion that the program like is being shelled to their wallet or their pocket, right? Like I'm assuming best intent, and by saying that if you trim fat and you overcut on these government programs, they're not impacting corporations, they're impacting people for most of these things, right? Like the DOE, if they are heavily invested in what they say they are, whether it's student loan programs or K through 12 education like Title I grants, which obviously is really important for low income students. If you overcut, like, you're impacting the education and the future prosperity and potential, and really like the allowance of someone to succeed, which for me is like a big thing. So I think it just depends, right? Like everyone should have an equal and adequate opportunity to succeed in the world. And sometimes if you trim too much fat, and you got to make sure where you're trimming from. I don't think that's why, like, I don't think you can blindly cut stuff, because to be honest with you, like, okay, so this is maybe where we'll disagree, but if you cut the 90 billion, let's say of the 90 billion you cut, you could cut 30, but instead you cut 50. But in doing that, let's say even 5 kids in low income areas get cut from like their transportation to school, or like their allowance to go to the school near their house, and now they can't do it. Like for me, that's a huge fuck up. Cause like as an American citizen, like the whole point is, right, land of the free, home of the brave, and you should have equal and adequate opportunity to succeed. And that's what capitalism is. And that's what we all should be fighting for. So that's the only worry I have, is overlooking and being too focused on saving an extra $10 billion, when at the end of the day, like, that is really a rounding error in the 6 trillion of budget that we have. And if it means, again, like we're impacting people and their potential, that's kind of where I'm like, that's not worth it for me.
Yeah. It's also worth noting that I'm coming from an extreme point of naivety, or I'm very naive in this, in the sense that, I grew up in New York, where we did have a really strong education system, and I went to a great school, so never had to really think about these things at all. So it's worth pointing that out for any listeners who might be like, this guy's an idiot. It's probably true, because growing up in New York, where all the programs are phenomenal, some of the best in the country, like, it's hard to see it from a different perspective. But yeah, I'm curious to see how that plays out. I'm sure we'll have another episode next week talking about it. Once again, check out the article that we had published on, today, and then the one from Tuesday as well. We will have another one on Sunday, and then hopefully some more pods next week as more news develops. But yeah, let's call it there.
Yeah, sounds good. Good chat.
Yep. See ya.
Now watch this drive.